A heavy engine block tore away from its chassis, dropping directly onto the French asphalt. The resulting physical impact crushed 6 racing machines simultaneously. Piercing the compacted aluminum cockpit, a snapped steering column punctured a British driver's abdomen and severed his internal organs. Medical teams spent 48 hours in a hopeless surgery, battling hemorrhaging before the racing legend finally died. This 1937 fatality remained the darkest mystery of the endurance circuit. 18 years later, this vehicle reappeared in a sensational London assassination, ultimately resulting in the death of a young woman. What exactly happened during this catastrophic event? How did the tragic death of the renowned British driver Pat Fairfield unfold on a French racetrack? And why did his specific racing machine become intertwined with the sensational London murder trial 18 years later? The forensic timeline of this cursed vehicle begins directly on the asphalt of the Circuit de la Sarthe, France. June 19, 1937. The legendary 24 hours of Le Mans endurance race was underway. The chronometers stationed near the pit lane indicated exactly 4:45 in the afternoon. The grid of competitors was merely in the opening phase of the grueling, day-long trial, completing their 8th lap around the unforgiving country roads. During this era of motorsport, the circuit did not feature modern safety barriers, wide runoff areas, or energy-absorbing tire walls. The track consisted simply of narrow public tarmac, bordered immediately by deep ditches, thick trees, and solid earthen banks. René Kiepert gripped the steering wheel of a blue Bugatti Type 44. Operating the French machine at the edge of its mechanical capability, the driver approached a notorious section of the track named Maison Blanche, translating directly to the White House. This specific sector possessed a deceptive, twisting architecture, funneling the speeding vehicles through a blind, high-speed kink located just before the main straightaway. Maison Blanche was not a standard, sweeping curve. It was a rapid sequence of directional changes visually obstructed by a farmhouse situated precariously close to the tarmac. Drivers entered the sector entirely blind, relying on memorized braking points rather than direct line of sight. The speedometer on Kiepert's dashboard registered 130 kilometers per hour. As the driver pushed the straight-8 engine block to deliver maximum torque, the Bugatti entered the sharp trajectory. The primitive, bias-ply racing tires struggled to maintain physical contact with the tarmac. The Bugatti Type 44 utilized a heavy steel ladder frame and rigid leaf springs, a structural design built for endurance rather than nimble evasion. When the lateral grip evaporated, the driver had no mechanical recourse. Sudden G-forces overwhelmed the solid axle suspension. The wheels lost all critical traction, breaking the established racing line. Rubber dragged across the asphalt, failing to correct the trajectory. The vehicle slid outward, careening off the racing surface and heading directly toward the perimeter. As the vehicle struck the steep, solid dirt embankment flanking the circuit, the right front suspension immediately collapsed under the kinetic impact. The unyielding French soil acted as a solid ramp. The sudden deceleration at the front wheel transferred all remaining forward energy into an upward launch. The heavy steel chassis vaulted directly into the air. Tumbling through the afternoon sky, the metal frame somersaulted over itself. The chassis shed heavy mechanical components, splintered wood, and hot engine fluids across the grass. Gravity pulled the ruined machine back down, slamming the twisted metal hard against the track surface. The Bugatti skidded to a halt, coming to a dead stop directly in the center of the narrow asphalt ribbon. Resting perpendicular to the racing line, the destroyed vehicle formed an impenetrable steel barricade. Plumes of vaporized castor oil and thick dust rose from the hot engine block, obscuring the wreckage. Kippert lay motionless inside the crushed aluminum cockpit, severely injured by the rolling impact. The track marshals possessed no electronic warning systems to alert the incoming grid. The destroyed Bugatti simply sat there, a silent obstruction waiting in the shadows of the blind corner. Kippert had effectively killed himself. But the real danger did not lie within the wrecked Bugatti chassis. It lived within the brutal, twisting architecture of the dirt itself, a sector named the White House. The wrecked Bugatti formed a lethal, stationary barricade across the asphalt, but the true architect of the impending slaughter was the underlying track topology itself. 1930s endurance racing did not utilize custom-built, laser-leveled sporting arenas surrounded by energy-absorbing safety infrastructure. The Circuit de la Sarthe consisted entirely of standard French provincial roads. Local authorities temporarily repurposed these agricultural routes for extreme mechanical competition once a year. The layout did not cater to the survival of the drivers. It merely followed the historical property lines of rural farms and old trade routes. The civil engineers who originally paved these paths designed them for horse-drawn carts and slow-moving local traffic, not for heavy steel projectiles operating at terminal velocity. The asphalt surface was severely crowned in the center to facilitate rainwater drainage into the adjacent fields. This convex, domed shape caused the extreme edges of the tarmac to slope precariously downward toward the dirt, constantly threatening to pull a speeding vehicle off the established racing line. Furthermore, the road surface itself consisted of primitive macadam, a crude mixture of crushed stone and liquid tar that degraded rapidly under the relentless friction of racing tires. By the 8th lap of the endurance event, the trajectory was already slick with dropped motor oil, unburned aviation fuel, and shredded rubber marbles, drastically reducing the coefficient of friction required to keep the vehicles anchored to the ground. Before reaching the safety of the pit lane, drivers navigated a long, accelerating section of the circuit. Engines operated at peak revolutions per minute for sustained periods. Speedometers registered terrifying numbers, ranging from 160 kilometers per hour for the smaller displacement vehicles, up to 270 kilometers per hour for the heavy, supercharged works entries. Traveling at 200 kilometers per hour, a racing machine covers over 55 meters of ground every single second. At these staggering velocities, the aerodynamic lift generated by the unrefined, boxy bodywork caused the steering to become terrifyingly light and unresponsive. The front wheels barely maintained physical contact with the abrasive road surface. Stopping a speeding 2-ton chassis in this era required hundreds of meters of unobstructed road. The braking systems relied exclusively on primitive cast-iron drum brakes operated by heavy mechanical cables rather than fluid lines. Lacking modern hydraulic pressure and heat-dissipating carbon-ceramic friction materials, these heavy metal drums suffered from severe thermal fade. Repeated heavy braking boiled the internal components and physically expanded the metal drums away from the internal brake shoes, rendering the middle pedal essentially useless during a panic stop. The tires consisted of narrow, bias-ply rubber strapped to wire-spoke wheels, offering a physical contact patch with the ground no larger than the palm of a human hand. The mechanical grip was always operating on the extreme, ragged edge of catastrophic failure. Maison Blanche was not a standard, mathematically engineered racing corner. It was a geographical anomaly. The layout featured a sharp, twisting kink funneling the wide approach road into a tight, restrictive chute. The sector earned its notorious name from an actual, physical structure. A solid white farmhouse sat directly alongside the asphalt, situated exactly at the apex of the curve. This brick-and-mortar building created an impenetrable visual barrier. Drivers approaching the braking zone stared directly at a solid wall of masonry. The crucial exit of the corner, The specific line of sight required to adjust steering input and throttle control remained entirely hidden behind the architecture. Navigating this sector required a terrifying level of blind commitment. The human operating the heavy wooden wheel had to lock the chassis into a specific, unalterable trajectory long before the exit became visible. As the sun began its descent in the late afternoon, the tall trees lining the approach cast long, alternating shadows across the tarmac. This rapid strobing effect of light and dark violently assaulted the driver's retinas, inducing severe visual fatigue and spatial disorientation. The deafening roar of the unsilenced straight-eight exhaust pipes masked any auditory warning of a crash ahead. The driver existed inside a sensory bubble of extreme mechanical vibration, toxic exhaust fumes, and blinding wind blast. Approaching the farmhouse, the driver downshifted through the heavy, unsynchronized gearbox, relying purely on muscle memory and raw courage to clip the unseen apex. There was no radio communication with the pit wall to warn of hazards. There were no electronic flag systems flashing yellow lights. The driver was isolated in the cramped cockpit, forced to trust that the track ahead remained clear. Modern motorsport engineering utilizes expansive runoff areas to mitigate the consequences of a mistake. Track designers pave miles of extended asphalt and dig deep gravel traps to safely catch and decelerate a vehicle that leaves the racing line. 1937. France offered zero margin for error. The edge of the asphalt abruptly transitioned into unyielding rural terrain. The total width of the racing surface at Maison Blanche measured barely 6 meters across. Flanking the left side of the narrow tarmac stood a steep, solid earth embankment. This was not a soft, forgiving barrier. It consisted of compacted agricultural dirt, dense tree roots, and field stones. Striking this berm at racing speeds transferred the lateral kinetic energy directly upward, acting as a geological ramp that instantly flipped heavy vehicles into the air, as demonstrated by Kippert's Bugatti. Bordering the right side of the road lay a deep, V-shaped agricultural drainage ditch carved into the earth to prevent flooding. Dropping a single pneumatic tire into this trench instantly snapped the steering column out of the driver's hands, sucking the entire chassis down into the earth and slamming the undercarriage against the concrete culverts. The combination of these specific environmental elements manufactured a perfect, inescapable physical snare. A blind entry, terminal velocity, a narrow asphalt corridor, solid walls of earth and ditch clamping down on both sides. Once an anomaly occurred within that funnel, the physical laws of inertia and momentum guaranteed a catastrophic chain reaction. The sector was essentially a mechanized meat grinder, patiently waiting for a single driver to make a fractional error in steering input. When the blue Bugatti crashed and stopped dead in the center of the tarmac, it altered the fundamental physics of the entire sector. The twisting agricultural road instantly became a closed canyon. The Bugatti chassis measured nearly 2 meters in width. Resting perpendicular to the racing line, it consumed a massive percentage of the available drivable surface. The incoming grid of racers, spaced only seconds apart, were currently approaching the farmhouse at full throttle, unaware of the steel wall waiting in the shadows. The immediate aftermath of the initial crash generated a dense cloud of atomized fluids. Boiling radiator water, vaporized castor oil from the cracked engine block, and pulverized topsoil filled the narrow corridor. This thick gray haze further reduced the already compromised visibility caused by the farmhouse. Incoming drivers were essentially driving into a smokescreen at terminal speed. The trap mechanics relied on the biological limits of the human nervous system. As the next driver cleared the blind apex, the visual input of the stationary wreckage finally hit their retina. The human brain requires approximately 1/4 of a second to process sudden visual data, recognize the mortal threat and send an electrical signal to the leg muscles. At racing speeds, the vehicle travels another 14 meters before the driver's leather boot even touches the brake pedal. Once the heavy brake pedal is depressed, the narrow tires immediately lock up, overwhelmed by the sudden kinetic demand. The car begins an uncontrolled four-wheel skid across the crowned, oil-slicked asphalt. The driver faces a mathematical equation with no surviving variables. They cannot steer left to avoid the wreckage. The dirt embankment will launch the car into the trees. They cannot steer right. The drainage ditch will swallow the chassis and crush the suspension. The only available trajectory is straight forward, carrying immense kinetic energy directly into the crushed steel of the initial wreck. The physics of a multi-car pileup operate on cruel, compounding mathematics. The first car creates the obstruction. The second car strikes the first, transferring its forward momentum into the stationary mass. The front crumple zones compress, pushing the heavy engine block backward into the cockpit, directly toward the driver's legs. The two tangled chassis now form a denser, heavier, and wider barricade, blocking the entire width of the road. The third car arrives seconds later, striking an even more unyielding wall of solid metal. Every subsequent impact strengthens the barricade, creating a dense knot of intertwined steel, leaking fuel, and trapped human bodies. The drivers operating these machines lacked any structural protection from the impending impacts. Open cockpits exposed their torsos to flying debris, hot oil, and blunt force trauma. Seatbelts were not utilized, governed by the grim logic that being thrown clear of a rolling chassis was preferable to being trapped and incinerated underneath it. The steering column consisted of a solid steel rod pointing directly at the driver's sternum, ready to act as a spear upon frontal impact. Behind the leather seat sat an unshielded, high-capacity aluminum fuel tank filled with highly volatile racing fuel. A heavy rear impact from the next incoming car instantly transformed the vehicle into an explosive device. The dirt embankments prevented evasion. The blind entry prevented anticipation. The narrow asphalt concentrated the destruction. Kippert provided the initial error, triggering the trap. The track was now fully armed, and Pat Fairfield was currently approaching the braking zone in his Fraser-Nash BMW, staring directly at the white brick wall, completely blind to the steel graveyard waiting just inches beyond the apex. Approaching the blind apex of Maison Blanche was Patrick George Fairfield. Born in 1907, the 30-year-old British national represented the absolute pinnacle of pre-war motorsport talent. The European press frequently dedicated broadsheet columns to dissecting his technique, universally labeling him a man possessing a natural talent for cornering. What journalists casually termed natural talent was in reality a brutal mastery of applied kinetic physics. Operating a 1930s Grand Prix vehicle demanded extraordinary neurological processing speed and raw physical endurance. These primitive racing machines lacked aerodynamic downforce. The bodywork did not press the chassis into the tarmac as speed increased. Instead, aerodynamic lift made the steering terrifyingly buoyant and unresponsive. To corner effectively, a driver had to deliberately brake the rear tire's traction. Approaching a bend, a professional executes a precise, calculated sequence, a sharp application of the mechanical drum brakes to transfer the vehicle's weight directly over the front axle, followed by a harsh twist of the heavy wooden steering wheel. This intentional disruption forces the rear of the car to slide outward. The driver then modulates the throttle pedal, utilizing the engine's torque to steer the car through the curve, balancing the heavy metal chassis entirely on the friction limit of 4 narrow strips of bias ply rubber. The precision exhibited by the British driver was not merely theoretical. Just weeks prior to arriving in France, Fairfield had decisively dominated the Coronation Trophy of 1937. Racing for the prestigious English Racing Automobiles organization, known globally as the ERA team, he navigated complex circuits with surgical consistency. A deep understanding of mechanical sympathy allowed him to extract maximum kinetic energy without shattering fragile gearboxes or boiling the brake fluid. The ERA vehicles were notorious for their potent supercharged engines and twitchy handling characteristics. Mastering an ERA meant mastering the ragged edge of control. For the grueling 24-hour endurance format at Le Mans, Fairfield partnered with David Murray. Together, they piloted a pristine, white Fraser-Nash BMW 328. This specific German-engineered machine featured a lightweight tubular steel frame and a highly advanced 2-liter, straight-six engine utilizing hemispherical combustion chambers. It was a precision instrument designed for sustained high-speed touring. Fairfield operated at the peak of his cognitive and physical abilities, reading the abrasive surface of the Circuit de la Sarthe like a familiar topographical map. He memorized every bump, every oil slick, and every optimal braking marker. However, the fatal flaw of the 1937 Le Mans grid lay not in the machinery, but in the institutional structure of the competition itself. The Automobile Club de l'Ouest, the organizing body of the prestigious event, operated under a remarkably loose regulatory framework. Modern motorsport enforces draconian qualifying requirements. Competitors must prove their competence on the asphalt, posting lap times within a strict percentage of the pole position to secure a spot on the starting grid. This rigorous vetting process ensures a baseline of professional skill and prevents deadly speed differentials on the track. The pre-war era possessed zero safety nets of this kind. Endurance racing functioned as an incredibly expensive endeavor, requiring vast capital to transport vehicles, hire mechanics, and purchase specialized racing fuel. To fill out the expansive grid and generate sufficient entry fees, organizers heavily relied upon the participation of gentlemen drivers. These individuals were wealthy industrialists, aristocrats, and passionate hobbyists who possessed the financial capital to purchase high-performance sports cars directly from the factory. Yet, they fundamentally lacked the thousands of hours of competitive track experience required to handle these powerful machines during a crisis. If a private entrant could afford the registration fee and present a vehicle that met basic technical specifications, the governing body granted them unrestricted permission to race alongside seasoned, battle-hardened professionals. This economic compromise created a lethal, unregulated ecosystem on the asphalt. The Circuit de la Sarthe transformed into a chaotic mix of factory-backed prototypes piloted by elite athletes, forced to share narrow public roads with inexperienced amateurs. The speed differential between a professional extracting maximum velocity from a racing line and a wealthy hobbyist braking far too early for a corner could easily exceed 100 kilometers per hour. The slower, unpredictable vehicles effectively became moving chicanes, requiring the professionals to constantly execute dangerous, high-speed evasive maneuvers. René Kiepert, the driver of the blue Bugatti Type 44, currently lying crushed and smoking across the apex of Maison Blanche, belonged squarely in this amateur category. He was a newcomer to the brutal, relentless realities of 24-hour endurance racing. Kiepert possessed the courage to enter the grueling event and the capital to field a French Bugatti, but he fundamentally lacked the neurological conditioning required to survive a critical mechanical anomaly at 130 kilometers per hour. When the Bugatti lost lateral traction entering the White House sector, the stark difference in experience dictated the fatal outcome. A veteran driver like Fairfield, sensing the sudden loss of grip through the steering column, would instinctively counter-steer. The professional immediately applies precise throttle input to pull the nose of the chassis back into alignment, using engine power to drag the car out of the slide. The trained brain processes the skid as a rapid mathematical equation to be solved. The amateur brain, flooded with sudden adrenaline and spatial disorientation, defaults to biological panic. Kippert likely applied heavy pressure to the brake pedal, the absolute worst possible reaction during a high-speed slide. Locking the wheels instantly negated any remaining steering control, turning the heavy Bugatti into an unguided ballistic missile that launched off the dirt embankment. The resulting crash was not a deliberate act of malice. It was the inevitable byproduct of systemic institutional negligence, allowing an inexperienced driver to navigate a blind, unyielding sector like Maison Blanche in a heavy, high-powered machine constituted a severe gamble with human life. Kippert's lack of car control sealed his own fate, crushing his body inside the rolling aluminum cockpit. But the organizers' willingness to mix eager amateurs with focused professionals transformed a single driving error into a multi-car slaughter. The loose regulations of the era permitted a deadly amateurism that directly compromised the safety of the entire grid. The tragedy of Pat Fairfield remains rooted in this grim, unavoidable intersection of professional genius and amateur incompetence. Approaching the Maison Blanche sector on his 8th lap, the British champion was executing a flawless mechanical sequence. His foot expertly modulated the accelerator of the Fraser-Nash BMW, maintaining optimal engine revolutions. His hands gripped the wheel, preparing for the precise weight transfer required to clip the blind apex. His brain calculated the exact breaking point based on his previous circuits. He performed his profession with the exact, calculated brilliance that earned him the coronation trophy. Every sensory input indicated the road ahead remained clear. The track marshals stationed along the route displayed no warning flags, possessing no time to react to the Bugatti's sudden crash. The setting sun cast confusing, strobing shadows across the asphalt, but Fairfield's deep memory of the circuit guided his inputs. Committing the white BMW to the corner, he carried maximum optimal speed into the shadow of the farmhouse. He possessed the physical skill to handle any loss of traction, any mechanical failure his own vehicle might present. But no amount of neurological superiority, no application of perfect steering geometry, and no mastery of throttle control can alter the physical reality of a stationary metal barricade. The institutional failure of Le Mans had placed an amateur in a machine he could not control, and that amateur had just deposited a crushed 2-ton roadblock directly into the path of a champion. Talent might have allowed Fairfield to control his own machine, but he could not control a hunk of scrap iron appearing behind a blind corner at maximum velocity. Smoke and vaporized castor oil from the wrecked Bugatti reduced visibility to zero at the Maison Blanche apex. Fritz Roth entered this opaque zone first. Piloting a BMW, the driver detected the stationary chassis blocking the tarmac. Pulling the steering wheel sharply to the right, Roth forced the vehicle into a severe lateral shift. The rigid leaf spring suspension failed to absorb the sudden load. The outside tires gripped the abrasive asphalt, transferring the forward kinetic energy into rotational force. The BMW flipped, rolling over multiple times before coming to a halt. A second metal obstruction now sealed the narrow circuit. Trailing fractions of a second behind, Pat Fairfield accelerated out of the blind curve. Driving the white Fraser-Nash BMW 328, bearing the registration plate FML9, the British champion faced a solid wall of steel. The steep dirt embankment restricted the left flank. The agricultural drainage ditch blocked the right. Pressing the cast-iron brake pedal provided insufficient stopping power against the established momentum. The physical collision operated strictly on deceleration physics. The Fraser-Nash struck the existing wreckage dead center. At the exact moment of impact, the sudden drop in velocity compromised the structural integrity of the tubular steel frame. The front chassis rails buckled and folded inward. Steel mounting brackets securing the 2-liter, straight-six engine snapped under the sheer force. The heavy power plant detached entirely from the engine bay, dropping straight onto the French tarmac. Inside the compressing aluminum cockpit, the engineering of 1937 offered zero driver protection. The rigid steering column did not collapse. The forward momentum pushed Fairfield's torso directly into the wooden steering wheel. The rim shattered. The solid metal shaft punctured his abdominal wall, driving deep into his digestive tract and severing multiple internal organs. The obstruction immediately widened. Jean Tremoulet arrived at the apex driving a heavy Delahaye sports car. Plunging into the dust, the French driver possessed zero reaction time. The front grille of the Delahaye rammed straight into the rear axle of Fairfield's destroyed BMW. The aerodynamic, wedge-shaped tail section of the Fraser-Nash functioned as a mechanical ramp. The kinetic energy launched the Delahaye airborne. The heavy vehicle somersaulted over the initial wreckage, crashing upside down onto the road and trapping its driver underneath. A competitor racing under the name RAF entered the sector in a Talbot. The front end of his machine smashed squarely into the expanding blockade, pushing the tangled metal further together. Seconds later, Forestier arrived in a Riley. His radiator drove deep into the crumpled rear frame of the Talbot. Boiling coolant hissed as it sprayed across the hot exhaust pipes. 6 individual racing machines were now stacked on top of one another. The narrow country road held a dense, interlocking structure of fractured glass, torn aluminum, and leaking aviation fuel. Pinned under a snapped steering column, Pat Fairfield lay bleeding internally inside a ruined vehicle. The endurance race continued, leaving the British driver trapped inside the exact machine that would surface 18 years later in a London homicide investigation. Extracting a crushed human form from a compressed tubular steel chassis required brute mechanical force. Deep inside the tangled wreckage at the Maison Blanche sector, breathing transformed into a desperate, agonizing reflex for the trapped driver. The rigid steering column of the Fraser-Nash BMW pinned the victim firmly against the leather seat squab. The 6-car pileup effectively blocked the entire racing circuit, forcing the Automobile Club de l'Ouest to issue an unprecedented safety directive. Track stewards neutralized the sector. Yellow caution flags commanded the surviving grid to reduce speed, forcing the remaining high-performance machines to navigate the narrow, oil-slicked strip of asphalt single file. Meanwhile, emergency crews utilized primitive steel pry bars and raw manual leverage to peel back the crumpled aluminum bodywork. To free the immobilized driver from the cockpit, trackside mechanics had to physically saw through the wooden steering wheel rim and dismantle the heavy metal steering shaft. The extraction process drained critical minutes from the survival clock. Once the driver was freed from the twisted metal constraints, medical personnel loaded the trauma victim onto a stretcher. The trackside ambulance navigated the rural French roads, transporting the casualty directly toward the De La Genière clinic located in the urban center of Le Mans. This specific medical facility routinely handled the standard localized traumas associated with endurance motorsport, treating superficial chemical burns, simple bone fractures, and minor lacerations. However, the physiological destruction sustained during the blind apex collision far exceeded standard clinical capabilities. The transit sequence itself compounded the internal physiological damage. Every bump on the unpaved provincial roads transferred kinetic energy directly into the shattered skeletal structure of the patient, exacerbating the internal bleeding. Outside the hospital walls, the 24-hour race continued its relentless auditory assault, the roar of straight-eight engines echoing through the city while the surgeons scrubbed in. Upon arrival at the surgical theater, attending physicians initiated a rapid physical trauma assessment. The resulting physiological profile mapped the ruthless, unforgiving mechanics of a double-impact collision. When the front grille of the Fraser Nash struck the stationary Bugatti, forward momentum abruptly zeroed. Inertia carried the driver's torso forward at racing speed. Milliseconds later, the heavy Delahaye rammed into the rear axle of the BMW. This secondary kinetic strike pushed the chassis and the driver's seat aggressively forward. The human body became trapped in an inescapable vice between two opposing kinetic vectors. The steering column functioned as a stationary steel anvil. The upper arc of the heavy wooden steering wheel impacted the sternum. The compressive force fractured multiple ribs along the anterior rib cage. The jagged bone segments pushed inward, compromising the pleural cavity and severely restricting the inflation capacity of the lungs. The lower arc of the steering wheel inflicted the most critical, life-threatening trauma. The solid structure drove deep into the soft tissue of the abdominal wall. The human abdomen lacks the thick skeletal shielding of the rib cage, leaving the internal organs extremely vulnerable to blunt force trauma. The compressive impact transferred intense hydrostatic shock directly into the digestive tract. The sheer physical pressure ruptured the small and large intestines in multiple locations. Gastric fluids, partially digested organic matter, and millions of bacteria instantly spilled into the sterile peritoneal cavity. This toxic breach initiated acute, aggressive peritonitis. Furthermore, the blunt force trauma sheared the delicate mesenteric blood vessels supplying the intestinal tract. Uncontrolled internal hemorrhaging began filling the abdominal cavity with blood. The circulatory system immediately struggled to maintain sufficient blood pressure to oxygenate the brain and vital organs, triggering the early stages of hypovolemic shock. Surgeons at the de la Genière Clinic administered ether anesthesia and prepped the operating table. Opening the abdominal cavity with the steel scalpel, the medical team confronted a physiological war zone. The medical technology of the 1930s offered severely limited solutions for catastrophic organ rupture. Synthetic antibiotics, the primary modern defense against severe internal infection, did not exist in the civilian medical supply chain. Blood transfusion protocols remained primitive and slow. The surgical staff worked frantically to locate the sheared blood vessels, using metal clamps to ligate the arterial bleeding. The doctors attempted to resect the severely damaged necrotic intestinal segments, trying to physically stitch the torn digestive tract back together. It was a desperate, reactive surgical procedure, attempting to outpace the rapid, constant drop in blood volume and the spreading bacterial infection. The medical team closed the incision, fully aware that the microscopic battle inside the peritoneal cavity remained unwinnable. For 48 consecutive hours, the champion driver fought a grueling biological endurance race on the hospital mattress. The physical stamina built through years of wrestling heavy racing machines around European circuits prolonged the inevitable systemic decline. The bacterial infection multiplied exponentially within the abdomen, dumping lethal toxins directly into the bloodstream. The resulting septicemia triggered a severe inflammatory response, spiking the core body temperature and inducing severe rigors. The kidneys, starved of oxygenated blood due to the internal hemorrhaging, began to shut down. The filtration system failed, allowing toxic cellular waste to accumulate in the circulatory system. The medical staff operated in a state of grim observation, documenting the steady, irreversible collapse of a patient they possessed no chemical or surgical tools to save. The biological systems finally reached the strict limits of compensation. At approximately 6 o'clock in the morning on Monday, June 21st, 1937, the cardiovascular system failed entirely. The heart muscle ceased pumping. The pulse flatlined. Pat Fairfield died in a quiet French hospital room, miles away from the smell of castor oil and burned rubber. His demise did not stem from a miscalculated braking point or a reckless overtaking maneuver. The fatal sequence required a specific, unlucky alignment of environmental variables: an amateur driver crashing at a blind apex, a narrow track bordered by steep ditches, and a lack of early warning flag systems. The British talent occupied the wrong geographical coordinates at the precise microsecond a mechanical trap snapped shut. The talent required to win the coronation trophy offered zero defense against a stationary block of iron hidden in the shadows. Fairfield was gone forever. Track officials swept the dried blood and fragmented glass from the Maison Blanche asphalt, and the racing world mourned the loss of a brilliant tactician. The endurance circuit moved on. But the crushed Fraser-Nash BMW bearing the license plate FML9 did not die on that dirt embankment. The wrecked metal carcass was hauled away from the circuit, stripped down to the bare tubular frame, and meticulously reassembled by automotive engineers. The cursed machine prepared itself for another dark act, a specific sequence of events that would culminate in a hanging sentence 18 years later. The biological existence of Pat Fairfield terminated on a sterile surgical table inside the De Legenière clinic. Medical orderlies disposed of the blood-soaked linens, and the hospital administration filed the official death certificate. However, the mechanical lifespan of his racing machine followed a much darker, unnatural trajectory. The tangled wreckage of the Fraser-Nash BMW 328, bearing the British registration plates FML9, sat abandoned in a rural French impound yard. The front chassis rails were bent inward. The engine block lay detached from the mounting brackets. The wooden steering wheel remained shattered, retaining the dark stains of the fatal abdominal trauma. Standard automotive protocol during the 1930s dictated a singular destination for a vehicle sustaining this specific level of catastrophic structural damage: the industrial scrap furnace. Heavy racing impacts compromise the fundamental metallurgical integrity of a steel chassis. The kinetic shock waves travel through the tubular frame, creating microscopic stress fractures and permanently warping the geometry required for safe, high-speed operation. Salvaging a crushed race car required an investment of specialized labor that typically exceeded the financial value of the raw materials. Yet, FML9 avoided the melting pot. The BMW 328 represented a pinnacle of pre-war automotive engineering, featuring a highly advanced 2-liter engine and a lightweight aerodynamic profile. It was a rare, expensive homologation special. Driven by raw economics and ignoring the grim history attached to the steering column, an unknown entity purchased the twisted metal carcass. The ruined machine was loaded onto a transport ferry, crossing the English Channel to undergo a clandestine resurrection on British soil. Rebuilding a vehicle extracted from a 6-car pileup demands brutal, precise mechanical intervention. Craftsmen dragged the crumpled frame into a specialized coach-building workshop. Acetylene torches roared to life, applying intense thermal heat to the warped tubular steel. Mechanics utilized heavy hydraulic rams and steel chains to physically pull the primary chassis rails back into factory alignment. Where the metal had folded and fatigued beyond the limits of structural repair, fabricators used rotary saws to cut away the necrotic steel, welding fresh metal tubing in its place. The aesthetic restoration required equal meticulousness. The original aluminum body panels, torn and compressed by the impact of the Delahaye, were discarded. Panel beaters stretched flat sheets of raw aluminum over wooden bucks, using traditional English wheels to recreate the sleek, aerodynamic curves of the original sports car. The blood-stained leather seat squab was unbolted and thrown into an incinerator. Upholsterers stitched fresh, unblemished leather over the interior frames. Mechanics installed a pristine, solid steering column, bolting a brand-new wooden steering wheel directly into the bulkhead, an exact replica of the instrument that had severed Fairfield's internal organs. Paint guns deposited multiple thick layers of fresh primer and gloss top coat over the repaired aluminum skin. This chemical application served as a perfect disguise. The fresh paint sealed away the microscopic scars of the acetylene welds. The pristine leather masked the location of the fatal trauma. The rebuilt Fraser Nash emerged from the workshop looking flawless, gleaming under the garage lights. It had entirely lost its visual identity as a mechanized death trap. Bureaucratic ledgers at the British Vehicle Licensing Office maintained the original paperwork. The vehicle retained its original chassis identification numbers and its specific registration mark, FML9. The machine returned to the public roads of London, camouflaged as a luxury grand tourer, carrying a lethal pedigree hidden deep beneath its polished exterior. For 5 decades, the true identity of FML9 remained obscured by shifting ownership logs and the passage of time. Successive owners drove the sports car through the English countryside, entirely ignorant of the fact that their hands gripped a steering system connected to a cursed chassis. The vehicle eventually required a comprehensive, concourse-level restoration. In 1987, the car arrived at the specialized workshop of Phil Thompson, a master mechanic renowned for his forensic knowledge of vintage BMW engineering. Thompson initiated a total teardown of the vehicle. His objective was to strip the car down to its fundamental raw materials, removing every component, every wire, and every drop of fluid until only the bare skeletal frame and body shell remained. Armed with chemical paint strippers and abrasive sanding wheels, Thompson began removing the accumulated layers of vintage paint from the aluminum bodywork. As the abrasive tools stripped away the glossy exterior, the bare, unpainted metal saw the light of day for the first time since the 1930s. Examining the exposed rear bodywork structure, located just behind the passenger seating area, Thompson discovered a profound structural anomaly. Welded directly into the offside rear quarter of the aluminum skin was a distinct circular metal plate. This patch was not a standard factory repair. It was a deliberate modification designed to seal a specific void in the bodywork. Thompson halted the sanding process. He cross-referenced the physical dimensions of the chassis with original BMW factory blueprints. Standard production models of the Fraser Nash BMW 328 featured a conventional 50-liter fuel tank mounted low in the rear chassis, utilizing a standard filler neck configuration. However, the grueling 24-hour format of the Le Mans endurance race demanded drastically extended driving stints between pit stops. To remain competitive, the English Racing Automobiles team engineers had modified Fairfield's specific vehicle prior to the 1937 race. They fabricated a secondary, high-capacity saddle tank. Routing the fuel lines for this auxiliary endurance tank required cutting a precise, circular hole directly through the rear exterior bodywork to accommodate an external quick-release filler cap. Following the catastrophic crash at Maison Blanche, the mechanics responsible for resurrecting the wrecked chassis in the late 1930s had discarded the specialized racing fuel tank. Converting the vehicle back to a standard road-going configuration, they no longer needed the external filler hole. Instead of fabricating an entirely new rear body section, the original repair team simply cut a circular disc of scrap aluminum and hastily welded it over the void. grinding the weld smooth and burying the evidence under a thick layer of body filler and paint. Staring at the circular weld seam in 1987, Thompson realized he was looking at an undeniable mechanical fingerprint. This was not a replica. This was not a standard production model. The patched hole proved, beyond a shadow of a forensic doubt, the true identity of the machine sitting in his workshop. Thompson ran his bare hands over the exposed steel tubing of the chassis. He was physically touching the exact metal structure that had absorbed the kinetic impact of René Coupert's Bugatti. He was leaning over the exact cockpit dimensions where Pat Fairfield had suffered his fatal crushing injuries. The vehicle had hidden its dark history beneath a coat of gloss paint for 50 years. The realization brought a chilling atmosphere to the restoration garage. FML9 was a mobile tomb. It was a machine that had tasted blood on the French asphalt, survived the scrapyard, and integrated itself back into civilian life. The mechanical resurrection of the BMW 328 was an act of profound defiance against the laws of probability. A vehicle subjected to a multi-car pileup at terminal velocity should not exist. Yet, the metal endured. Thompson completed the restoration, ensuring the engine ran with perfect timing and the aluminum skin shone without a single blemish. The mechanical components functioned with the precision of a Swiss watch. The car did not belong in a static museum display. It was an active, functioning piece of machinery. The restored Fraser Nash rolled out of the workshop and back onto the tarmac. The machine possessed a pristine exterior and a cursed internal architecture. It had already demonstrated its capacity to function as the central element in a fatal tragedy. Escaping the pileup at Maison Blanche, the vehicle returned to the bustling streets of London. It prowled the affluent neighborhoods, blending seamlessly with the post-war traffic. The engine idled smoothly. The steering responded with sharp accuracy. The registration plate FML9 remained bolted firmly to the front bumper. The machine was ready. It simply waited for the calendar to turn to 1955. It waited for the neon lights of a London nightclub, and it waited for a young hostess named Ruth Ellis to step into its shadow, gripping a loaded revolver, preparing to pull the trigger and cement the vehicle's legacy in the darkest chapter of British criminal history. The calendar turned to 1955, and the cursed Fraser Nash BMW required a new operator. The British registration documents for FML9 transferred ownership to a man named David Blakely. Much like Pat Fairfield, Blakely possessed a competitive racing license and a dangerous affinity for velocity. He drove fast cars, consumed staggering quantities of alcohol, and maintained a deeply volatile personal life. The pristine white sports car, hiding its French graveyard history beneath a fresh coat of paint, became his primary mode of transport through the affluent, gaslit streets of London. Blakely entangled himself in a toxic, destructive relationship with a young nightclub manager named Ruth Ellis. Their dynamic operated on a vicious cycle of jealousy, physical abuse, and bitter resentment. Ellis navigated a harsh underground world in the West End, surviving through sheer grit. Blakely, conversely, relied on his charm and his racing pedigree, frequently utilizing the gleaming BMW to project an aura of aristocratic success. The tension between the two escalated over several months, building toward a lethal, unavoidable kinetic release. The white racing machine, having previously served as a steel anvil for a crushing death, now transitioned into the focal point of a premeditated execution. Easter Sunday, April 10, 1955. The Hampstead district of North London settled into a cold, quiet holiday evening. The Magdala Public House, a brick-fronted tavern located on South Hill Park, served a crowded room of local patrons. Blakely parked FML9 directly outside the establishment, leaving the sleek, aerodynamic chassis resting under the glow of the street lamps. He was actively evading Ellis, refusing her phone calls and hiding within the crowded pub with friends. Ellis did not arrive at the Hampstead location seeking a diplomatic resolution. Concealed deep within the pocket of her coat rested a Smith & Wesson .38 caliber revolver. This specific piece of American engineering utilizes a rotating cylindrical magazine containing 6 centerfire cartridges. Operating the double-action mechanism requires deliberate physical effort. Pulling the heavy steel trigger cocks the hammer backward, aligns a fresh chamber with the barrel, and drops the firing pin in one continuous mechanical motion. It is a close-range tool designed strictly for stopping power. At approximately 9:30 in the evening, the heavy wooden doors of the Magdala swung open. Blakely exited the pub, walking down the pavement toward the parked Fraser Nash. The streetlights illuminated the polished aluminum bodywork and the wire-spoke wheels. Stepping out from the surrounding shadows, Ellis intercepted his path. She called his name. Blakely ignored the greeting, turning his back and reaching directly for the door handle of FML 9. The first squeeze of the trigger ignited the chemical propellant. Expanding gunpowder gases forced a lead projectile down the rifled barrel. The initial shot missed the racing driver entirely. The sudden, deafening detonation shattered the quiet suburban night. Recognizing the mortal threat, Blakely abandoned the car door and attempted to sprint away from the vehicle. Taking deliberate, cold aim, Ellis fired the weapon a second time. The .38 caliber bullet struck Blakely squarely in the back. The kinetic impact severed his spinal column, dropping him instantly to the sidewalk. He collapsed face first onto the pavement, his body coming to rest mere inches from the tires of FML 9. Standing over the paralyzed driver, Ellis proceeded to empty the remaining chambers of the cylinder. Successive lead projectiles tore through his liver, his lungs, and his digestive tract, while her final 6th shot was fired blindly into the pavement, ricocheting off the hard stone and embedding itself into the hand of a passing bystander. The ballistic damage inflicted upon Blakely's internal organs eerily mirrored the catastrophic blunt force trauma Pat Fairfield suffered on the French dirt embankment 18 years prior. Blood pooled across the cold stone, reflecting the gleaming chrome of the BMW's exhaust pipe. FML 9 sat silently idling, physically present for another localized slaughter. Having spent all 6 rounds, the shooter stood motionless within the dissipating gun smoke. She made no attempt to flee the scene. Turning to an off-duty police officer who had rushed from the pub, she handed over the empty revolver. She calmly requested that he contact the authorities. The British judicial system of the 1950s operated with swift, uncompromising mechanical rigidity. Detectives transported Ellis to Holloway Prison, locking her inside a solitary cell. The ensuing trial commenced at the Old Bailey, the Central Criminal Court of England. To secure a murder conviction, the prosecution needed to prove premeditated malice aforethought. The defense counsel attempted to argue extreme emotional provocation, citing Blakely's history of physical abuse. Taking the witness stand, the defendant provided a chilling, unequivocal confession that dismantled her own legal defense. When the prosecuting counsel asked what she intended to do when she fired the revolver at close range, Ellis leaned into the microphone. She stated, clearly and without hesitation, "It was obvious when I shot him I intended to kill him." That single, unvarnished sentence sealed her fate. The legal framework offered no leniency for crimes of passion resulting in calculated gunfire. The jury required only 14 minutes of deliberation to return a guilty verdict. The presiding judge placed a square of black silk upon his wig and pronounced the mandatory sentence, death by hanging. Public sympathy ignited across the nation. thousands of citizens signed petitions demanding a reprieve, arguing that the severe emotional abuse she suffered warranted a lesser sentence. Newspapers published daily editorials debating the morality of executing a young mother. However, the Home Secretary denied all appeals, refusing to intervene in the judicial process. The execution date remained fixed. On the morning of July 13th, the executioner, Albert Pierrepoint, entered the condemned cell at Holloway Prison. Pierrepoint represented the ultimate instrument of state-sanctioned kinetic force. The mechanics of the British gallows require precise mathematical calculation to ensure instant death rather than slow strangulation. The executioner measures the prisoner's height and weight to determine the exact necessary length of the manila hemp rope. If the drop is too short, the victim suffocates. If the drop is too long, the kinetic energy decapitates the body. Pierrepoint strapped the prisoner's arms securely behind her back using leather belts. Leading her out of the holding cell and directly into the execution chamber, he positioned her over the center of the wooden trapdoor. A white cotton hood descended over her face, blocking out the light. The executioner slipped the heavy noose around her neck, adjusting the brass eyelet so it rested directly beneath her left jawbone. Pulling a heavy metal lever, withdrew the iron retaining bolts holding the trapdoor flush with the floor. Gravity instantly pulled the female body downward into the pit. The sudden, violent deceleration at the end of the rope snapped the cervical vertebrae. The impact severed the spinal cord and caused immediate brain death. Ruth Ellis swung in the dark, officially becoming the last woman executed in the United Kingdom. The cursed loop of the Fraser-Nash BMW 328 was now mathematically complete. A single tubular steel chassis connected 3 distinct corpses across 2 decades. One driver crushed his internal organs against the steering column on a French dirt embankment, a victim of amateur negligence and unforgiving track geometry. A second driver bled to death from gunshot wounds beside its tires on a London street, a casualty of a toxic romance. A young woman swung from a hemp rope inside a cold British prison because she pulled a trigger beside that exact same vehicle. The machine absorbed the kinetic energy of Le Mans and the ballistic trauma of Hampstead. It survived the scrapyard, it survived the gunfire, and it left a trail of ruined human anatomy in its wake. The trapdoor at Holloway Prison closed the final chapter on the cursed Fraser-Nash chassis, but the geographical snare in the French countryside remained fully operational. The 1937 disaster exposed a fatal administrative flaw within the Automobile Club de l'Ouest. Track officials could no longer ignore the brutal physics generated by extreme speed differentials. Endurance motorsport had rapidly outgrown its aristocratic origins. Allowing inexperienced hobbyists to purchase high-performance prototypes and share the tarmac with seasoned Grand Prix veterans created an unavoidable hazard. When a novice lost traction at 130 kilometers per hour, the resulting mechanical failure directly penalized the professionals running behind them. Pat Fairfield surrendered his life to this specific institutional negligence. The multi-car collision proved that the Circuit de la Sarthe required the strict driver qualification standards, effectively signaling the slow demise of the gentleman amateur era. Despite the clear forensic evidence left on the asphalt, the track geometry at Maison Blanche survived the pre-war era intact. The white brick farmhouse stood resolute against the edge of the road, continuing to cast its dangerous shadows over the braking zone. The unyielding dirt embankments and deep agricultural ditches maintained the narrow, inescapable funnel. For another 3 decades, engineers developed faster, more aerodynamic racing prototypes. Yet, drivers were forced to thread these advanced machines through the exact same primitive agricultural layout. The blind kink continued to claim shattered suspensions and broken bones, punishing any driver who missed the crucial turn-in point by a fraction of a second. Physics and rising terminal velocities eventually forced a permanent structural intervention. By the early 1970s, sports cars were generating immense aerodynamic downforce and reaching speeds that made the old rural roads mathematically unnavigable. Track organizers finally conceded that the White House sector functioned as an unacceptable, uncontrollable variable. In 1972, the administrative body ordered a sweeping geographical redesign of the circuit's final sector. Surveyors abandoned the old provincial route entirely. Civil engineers deployed heavy earth-moving equipment to carve a specialized, custom-built section of track into the surrounding fields. This new complex, officially named the Porsche Curves, featured a flowing high-speed sequence of corners equipped with modern safety barriers and adequate runoff areas. The new asphalt deliberately bypassed the notorious farmhouse, redirecting the racing grid away from the blind apex that had triggered the 1937 incident. The original stretch of macadam, where René Kiepert rolled his Bugatti and Fairfield suffered his fatal abdominal trauma, was decommissioned from competitive use. The isolated strip of road reverted to standard civilian traffic. Eliminating Maison Blanche removed the deadliest natural trap from the 24-hour endurance layout. Administrators required 35 years of shattered fiberglass and bent steel to correct the geographical error. The British champion paid the ultimate price to highlight a blind corner that never belonged on a professional racetrack. The death of Pat Fairfield at Maison Blanche exposed the lethal cost of amateurism on the racing circuit. Yet, the cruelest legacy remains the blood curse the FML9 machine carried back to English soil. He pushed the limits of speed and left his mark on motorsport history. What are your honest thoughts on Pat Fairfield's final ride and this horrifying chain of tragedies? Drop a comment below. If you liked this video, please subscribe to Terminal Velocity so we can open the next dark case files together. Thanks for tuning in, and farewell.